The morning sun reflected off the glass and steel skyscrapers of Manhattan as David Miller strode down Fifth Avenue. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the sidewalk with each hurried step. The custom-tailored charcoal suit he wore marked him as someone of significance in the financial district, though today his usually composed demeanor showed signs of strain. "Listen, Jenkins, I need those numbers before the board meeting," David barked into his phone, weaving through the crowd of morning commuters. His leather briefcase, worn but expensive, swung precariously from his left hand as he gestured with his right. "No, that's not acceptable. We're talking about $100,000 in cash for the Singapore deal. The partners want to see proof of liquidity today." The street buzzed with its usual morning chaos. Yellow cabs honked their horns, street vendors called out to passing tourists, and the subway rumbled beneath the pavement. David's attention remained fixed on his phone conversation, his free hand now running through his graying hair in frustration. "Fine, just get it done," he snapped, ending the call. As he reached to pocket his phone, the briefcase slipped from his grasp. It hit the sidewalk with a solid thud, but in the rush-hour noise, David didn't notice. He continued walking, his mind already racing ahead to his next meeting. Half a block behind, a group of teenagers noticed the fallen briefcase. 3 boys, wearing hoodies despite the warm weather, approached it cautiously. The tallest one picked it up, testing its weight. "Yo, check this out," he called to his friends. They huddled around it, trying to work the combination locks on either side. Their attempts grew increasingly frustrated as the locks refused to yield. From the shadow of a nearby doorway, Malik watched the scene unfold. His worn jeans and faded t-shirt helped him blend into the background, making him nearly invisible to the passing crowds. His dark eyes tracked the briefcase with interest, noting how the businessman had dropped it and how the group now struggled with it. 20 minutes later, David reached the lobby of his office building. As he approached the security desk, his hand instinctively went to check for his briefcase. His fingers grasped empty air. The color drained from his face as realization hit. "No, no, no," he muttered, patting his sides as if the briefcase might materialize. He spun around, scanning the lobby frantically. Security guards watched with mild concern as David rushed back outside. The morning crowd had thickened considerably. David tried to retrace his steps, but the sea of pedestrians made it impossible to move quickly. Cars packed the street bumper to bumper, their exhaust adding to the morning haze. Sweat began to bead on his forehead as panic set in. He stopped random pedestrians, his voice growing more desperate with each inquiry. "Excuse me, did you see a black leather briefcase? Anyone?" A briefcase. But in typical New York fashion, most people hurried past without even acknowledging him. Standing on the corner where he'd been on the phone, David felt the weight of helplessness settle over him. $100,000 gone. His reputation, his deals, everything he'd worked for, all potentially ruined because of one moment of carelessness. After the group of teenagers gave up on opening the briefcase, Malik emerged from his doorway. He waited until they disappeared around the corner before approaching the abandoned case. The leather was smooth under his calloused fingers as he picked it up, feeling its substantial weight. Malik carried the briefcase to his usual spot, a quiet alley behind a restaurant where the owner sometimes left him leftovers. He sat cross-legged on a flattened cardboard box, examining the locks more carefully than the teenagers had. Years of surviving on the streets had taught him patience. After several careful attempts at different combinations, one of the locks clicked open. Inside, neat stacks of $100 bills filled the briefcase. Malik's hands trembled as he counted. $100,000. More money than he'd ever seen in his life. More than enough to change everything. For a long moment, he just stared at the money. He could almost see the possibilities it represented: a real bed to sleep in, regular meals, maybe even a chance to finish school. The temptation felt like a physical weight on his chest. Meanwhile, David's search had become increasingly frantic. He'd called his office to postpone his meetings, claiming a family emergency. Now he paced the streets, his expensive suit collecting dirt as he peered into gutters and underparked cars. "It has to be here somewhere," he muttered, ignoring the strange looks from passers-by. His phone rang constantly, Jenkins, board members, partners, but he let the calls go to voicemail. Without that cash, the Singapore deal would fall through. His reputation in the financial district, built over 20 years of careful networking and deal-making, would be irreparably damaged. In the alley, Malik had closed the briefcase. He pulled out his battered smartphone, a gift from a local charity organization. The screen was cracked, but it still worked well enough for basic searches. He opened social media and typed, David Miller, New York. The results showed a man in expensive suits at charity galas and business functions. Articles mentioned his success in finance, his Manhattan penthouse, his reputation for closing impossible deals. Malik found his business address easily, the Morrison Building on Fifth Avenue. David had returned to his office by now, though he barely recognized himself in the reflection of the elevator doors. His suit was disheveled, his face haggard. The weight of potential ruin pressed down on him. He'd have to tell the board something. Maybe he could liquidate some personal assets, though that would take time he didn't have. The elevator doors opened to reveal his assistant's concerned face. Mr. Miller, the board is asking about the Singapore presentation. Should I reschedule for tomorrow? David loosened his tie, feeling like it was choking him. I don't know, he admitted, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. He walked past her into his office and closed the door, something he rarely did. Back on the street, Malik had made his decision. He tucked the briefcase under his arm and began walking toward the Morrison Building. Each step felt heavy, like his feet were made of lead. People gave him a wide berth on the sidewalk, some clutching their bags closer as he passed. He was used to these reactions, but today they stung more than usual. The midday sun beat down on him as he walked, making him wish he had water. But he didn't stop. The briefcase seemed to grow heavier with each block, as if the weight of his decision was adding to its bulk. Yet something inside him, something stronger than hunger or thirst or the promise of financial security, kept him moving forward. The Morrison Building loomed ahead of Malik, its glass facade reflecting the afternoon sun. He stood across the street for several minutes, watching people in business attire stream in and out through the revolving doors. Security guards stood alert in the lobby, their uniforms crisp and intimidating. Malik's reflection in a nearby window caught his attention. His worn clothes and unkempt appearance stood in stark contrast to the polished environment he was about to enter. He attempted to smooth down his shirt and run fingers through his hair, but the improvements were minimal. The revolving door felt like a barrier between two worlds. As Malik approached, one of the security guards straightened up, his hand moving instinctively toward his radio. Malik tightened his grip on the briefcase and forced himself to walk forward with purpose. "Excuse me," the guard called out, stepping in front of him. "Do you have business in the building?" Malik swallowed hard but met the guard's eyes. "I'm here to see David Miller." "It's important." The guard's skepticism was obvious. "Mr. Miller doesn't see anyone without an appointment." "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." "Please," Malik insisted, lifting the briefcase slightly. "This belongs to him." "It's his briefcase." This caught the guard's attention. After a brief radio conversation with someone upstairs, Malik found himself escorted to the elevator by two guards. The other occupants pressed themselves against the walls, creating a clear space around him. The elevator ride to the 47th floor felt endless. Meanwhile, David sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen without really seeing it. The Singapore deal was unraveling. He'd received 3 emails in the past hour asking about the cash verification. His phone buzzed again, probably another board member demanding answers. A knock at his door made him jump. His assistant's voice came through, "Mr. Miller. There's someone here to see you. He says he has your briefcase." David practically ran to the door, throwing it open. His eyes fell on Malik, standing between 2 security guards, holding the familiar leather briefcase. For a moment, David couldn't process what he was seeing. "Is this your briefcase, sir?" one of the guards asked. David nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the case. Yes, it is." Malik stepped forward, extending the briefcase. "You dropped it this morning on Fifth Avenue. I found it and, well, here it is." David took the briefcase with trembling hands. He opened it right there in the doorway, needing to verify its contents. The money was all there, every stack exactly as he'd left it. He looked up at Malik, really seeing him for the first time. The contrast between them couldn't have been starker. David in his $1,000 suit, standing in his luxury office, and Malik in his worn clothes, looking out of place yet somehow more dignified than anyone else in the room. You found this and brought it back." David's voice carried a note of disbelief. "Why?" Malik shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny. It was the right thing to do. David dismissed the security guards with a wave, still staring at Malik as if trying to solve a puzzle. In his world of high finance and calculated risks, such straightforward honesty seemed almost foreign. "Please, come in," David said finally, stepping aside to let Malik enter his office. His assistant watched with wide eyes as the young man walked past her desk. Inside the office, Malik stood awkwardly, taking in the floor-to-ceiling windows, the expensive artwork, the views of Manhattan spreading out below them. David closed the door, still holding the briefcase like a lifeline. David gestured toward a leather chair, watching as Malik hesitantly settled into it. The young man's posture remained tense, as if ready to leave at any moment. David sat behind his desk, placing the briefcase carefully beside him. "Can I get you something? Water? Coffee?" David offered, noticing how Malik's clothes hung loose on his frame. "Water would be good," Malik replied quietly. David asked his assistant to bring in water and some sandwiches from the break room, noting how Malik's eyes followed the request with barely concealed hunger. "How long have you been on the streets?" David asked directly, studying the young man before him. Malik took a long drink of water before answering. "About 8 months now. Lost my grandmother, she was raising me. Couldn't afford the apartment after that. And school. Had to drop out. Junior year." Malik's fingers traced patterns on the water glass. Hard to focus on trigonometry when you're trying to figure out where to sleep. David leaned back in his chair, processing this information. The sandwich plate arrived, and he noticed how Malik tried to eat slowly, maintaining dignity despite his obvious hunger. "You found a briefcase with enough money to solve all those problems," David said. "Most people wouldn't have brought it back." Malik set down his sandwich, meeting David's eyes. "Money that isn't earned doesn't solve problems. It creates them. I've seen enough of that on the streets." The answer surprised David. In his world, money was the solution to everything. Yet here was someone who had nothing, choosing integrity over instant wealth. "What would you do?" David asked. "If you had the opportunity to change your situation." Malik was quiet for a moment. "I'd go back to school," he finally said. "I was good at math. Really good. My teacher said I could get a scholarship if I kept my grades up." His voice carried a hint of pride that quickly faded. "But that feels impossible now." "Nothing's impossible," David replied automatically, then caught himself. It was the kind of platitude wealthy people often offered, empty of real meaning. "Try enrolling in school without an address," Malik challenged. "Or studying without a quiet place to sleep. Or keeping clean clothes without a washing machine." His voice wasn't bitter, just matter of fact. David fell silent. He'd never had to consider such basic obstacles. His own problems, like nearly losing the briefcase, seemed superficial in comparison. "I could help," he offered suddenly, surprising himself. "With school, I mean. And housing." Malik's expression hardened slightly. "I didn't bring back your briefcase for a reward." "I know that," David said quickly. "That's actually why I want to help. Because you didn't ask for anything in return." Malik stood up, his posture defensive. "I don't want to be a charity case. Or have someone feel responsible for me." "What about an investment then?" David suggested, recognizing the pride in Malik's stance. "In your education. Your future. You'd pay it back by succeeding." Malik's hand was on the door handle now. "Why would you do that? You don't know anything about me." David looked at the briefcase. "You've shown me more about character in one action than most people I know have shown in years. That seems worth investing in." The next morning, David waited in his car outside the Sunrise Youth Shelter. He'd spent the previous evening making calls, pulling strings to secure Malik a spot. Now he watched as Malik approached, carrying everything he owned in a small backpack. "You don't have to do this," Malik said as he got into the car. His voice betrayed his unease. "The shelter has a good reputation," David replied, pulling away from the curb. "They have tutoring programs, counseling, job training. It's a start." The shelter staff welcomed Malik with professional warmth, but David noticed how some residents eyed them suspiciously. The contrast between his expensive suit and their surroundings was stark. Malik seemed to shrink into himself as they toured the facility. Later that week, they visited Riverside High School. David had arranged a meeting with the principal, using his influence to facilitate Malik's re-enrollment. As they walked the hallways between classes, students stared openly. Some whispered behind their hands. "He's probably dealing drugs," one student said loudly enough to be heard. "That's how these guys always get their hooks into rich people." Malik's shoulders tensed, but he kept walking. David wanted to confront the student but recognized it would only make things worse. In the principal's office, bureaucracy became another form of prejudice. "Our concern," the principal said, adjusting his glasses, "is that students with gaps in their education often struggle to adjust." "I was on the honor roll," Malik interjected quietly. "Before everything happened." The principal smiled thinly. "Yes, but that was some time ago. Perhaps a GED program would be more appropriate." David leaned forward. "Malik will be enrolling as a full-time student. If there are concerns about adjustment, I'm happy to arrange private tutoring." The meeting continued in this vein, each objection met with a solution backed by David's influence and resources. Finally, enrollment papers were produced, though the principal's reluctance was obvious. That evening, in the shelter's common room, Malik's composure finally cracked. "Maybe they're right," he said, staring at the forms. "Maybe I don't belong there." "Why would you think that?" David asked, sitting across from him. "You saw how they looked at me. Like I was contaminated." Malik's voice wavered. "My dad left when I was 3. Mom couldn't handle it, started using. Grandma raised me until..." He stopped, collecting himself. "People see someone like me coming back to school, they assume I'm trouble." David listened as Malik continued, describing years of watching his mother's descent into addiction, of caring for his grandmother through her illness, of trying to maintain his grades while their world crumbled. The story emerged in fragments, each revealing another layer of hurt beneath Malik's composed exterior. "I keep thinking about that briefcase," Malik admitted. $100,000. Could have changed everything. Could have gotten my own place, bought my way in somewhere. Nobody would have known." "But you'd have known," David said quietly. Malik nodded. "Grandma used to say character is what you do when nobody's watching. She worked 2 jobs, never took a handout. And here I am, taking help from a stranger." "There's a difference between a handout and a hand up," David replied. "Your grandmother took jobs because she wanted to give you a better future. I'm offering resources for the same reason." "Why, though?" Malik asked. "Really? Is it guilt? Pity?" David considered the question carefully. "When you returned that briefcase, you showed me something I'd forgotten existed: integrity without agenda. In my world, every action has an angle. Every favor comes with strings. You reminded me there's another way to live." Malik was quiet for a long moment. "I don't want to disappoint you." "The only person you need to worry about disappointing is yourself," David responded. "I'm just providing opportunities. What you do with them is up to you." In the weeks that followed, David began noticing changes in his social circle. At a charity gala, he found himself increasingly irritated by the superficial conversations around him. "David, darling," cooed Margaret Whitman, a board member's wife, champagne glass in hand. "We've missed you at the club. Someone said they saw you in that dreadful part of town near the youth shelter." "Surely not." "Actually, yes," David replied, watching her perfectly maintained smile falter. "I've been working with the kids there. You should visit sometime." "Oh, how charitable of you," she managed, before quickly finding reason to be elsewhere. Similar scenes played out across his social calendar. Longtime associates grew distant when they realized his interest in community work wasn't just for show. Others tried to capitalize on it, suggesting partnerships that would look good for their corporate image. At his office, David began reviewing his client list. He was surprised to discover how many of his business relationships were built on mutual manipulation rather than genuine value. He started declining invitations to exclusive events he once considered essential for networking. Meanwhile, Malik was fighting his own battles at school. The tutoring sessions were helping him catch up academically, but social integration proved more challenging. During lunch periods, he often sat alone, other students maintaining a careful distance. One afternoon, David found him studying in the shelter's common room instead of the school library. "The library's quieter," David observed. Malik kept his eyes on his textbook. Some guys were making comments, saying I must be doing something illegal to have you helping me. It's easier to study here. David felt a familiar surge of anger, but Malik continued before he could respond. "But you know what's funny? For the first time, I don't care what they think. I got an A on my calculus test yesterday. The teacher said I might be able to take advanced placement classes next semester." Pride replaced the anger in David's chest. "That's excellent news." "Yeah," Malik smiled slightly. "Though I wish my clothes didn't make me stand out so much." David had noticed this too. While the shelter provided basics, Malik's worn clothes marked him as different among his peers. But he'd been hesitant to offer more help, respecting Malik's pride. "What if you earned some new clothes?" David suggested. "I need help organizing a community project. Could pay you for your time." Malik looked up, suspicious. "What kind of project?" "I've been thinking about what you said about other kids at the shelter. About opportunities. Maybe we could create some." Over the next few days, they developed a plan for a mentorship program, matching successful professionals with shelter youth. Malik's insight proved invaluable, helping identify potential problems David hadn't considered. "You can't just have rich people swooping in to save kids," Malik explained. "It needs to be about respect. Partnership. And the kids need to be able to earn their way, like I am." David watched as Malik grew more animated, describing ways to build trust and create genuine opportunities. Gone was the defensive posture, replaced by confident enthusiasm. "You should present this at the next shelter board meeting," David suggested. Malik's enthusiasm dimmed. "Me? Talk to the board. It's your insight driving this. You understand both sides of the equation." "I don't know," Malik hedged. "Those people, they're not going to want to hear from someone like me." "They need to hear from someone like you," David corrected. "Otherwise, they'll keep creating programs that look good on paper but don't actually help." The community center's auditorium buzzed with activity. David had rented the space for their first mentorship program event, and the turnout exceeded expectations. Dozens of young people from various shelters filled the seats, while potential mentors, lawyers, doctors, business owners, stood along the walls. David watched from the podium as Malik helped direct people to their seats. The new clothes they'd bought with his project earnings made him look like any other teenager, though his demeanor carried a maturity beyond his years. "Quite a crowd," said James Peterson, a hedge fund manager David had known for 20 years. "Though I must say, David, this is an unusual venue for you. Last time we met was at the Metropolitan Club." "Things change," David replied, observing the mixture of faces in the audience. "Sometimes for the better." "Indeed," James said, his tone skeptical. "Though I have to wonder about your involvement with these people. There's talk in the boardroom, you know. Concerns about your focus. These people, as you call them, have shown me more genuine humanity than I've seen in most boardrooms," David responded firmly. Before James could reply, Malik approached the podium. "We're ready to start, Mr. Miller." David nodded, stepping up to the microphone. As he introduced the program, he noticed several of his old social circle shifting uncomfortably in their designer suits, clearly out of their element. The presentations began with success stories from other mentorship programs. Then came testimonials from shelter residents, each story highlighting both challenges and determination. The audience grew more engaged, the initial awkwardness giving way to genuine interest. "Your next speaker," David announced, "is someone who showed me that character isn't measured by the size of your bank account, but by the strength of your principles. Malik Thompson." Malik walked to the podium, his step steady despite the hundreds of eyes focused on him. He began sharing his story, finding the briefcase, making the decision to return it, and the opportunities that followed. "But this isn't about one person's good fortune," Malik continued, his voice growing stronger. "It's about creating a system where doing the right thing opens doors instead of just earning a pat on the head. Where potential isn't wasted because of circumstances beyond our control. David watched as the audience leaned forward, caught by Malik's authenticity. Even James had stopped checking his phone. We're not asking for handouts, Malik emphasized. We're asking for partnerships. Opportunities to prove ourselves. A chance to show that talent and determination exist everywhere, not just in privileged zip codes. After the presentation, James approached David again. Well, that was unexpected, he admitted. The boy makes some good points. His name is Malik, David corrected. And yes, he does. Still, James persisted, lowering his voice, there are questions about your judgment lately. The Singapore deal barely closed. You're spending time in shelters instead of the club. People are wondering if you're having some sort of crisis. David looked around the auditorium, where potential mentors and ments were now mingling, exchanging contact information and ideas. He saw Malik deep in conversation with a software engineer, gesturing enthusiastically about something. No crisis, James, David replied. Just clarity. For the first time in years, I'm investing in something real. The youth center's makeshift stage felt like an insurmountable obstacle to Malik. He stood behind the curtain, watching as more people filed in for the mentorship program's first monthly meeting. The success of the launch event had attracted even more participants, and now they expected him to speak again. I can't do this, Malik whispered, his hands gripping the speech notes he'd prepared. These kids look up to me now. What if I mess up? David stood beside him, observing the growing crowd. Remember your calculus final last week? Got an A-, Malik replied automatically. And you were nervous about that too. But you prepared, you focused, and you succeeded. David straightened Malik's collar. Same principle applies here. Through the curtain, they could hear the murmur of conversation. Several teens from the shelter were there, kids who, just weeks ago, had been skeptical of Malik's involvement with David. Now they sat in the front row, waiting to hear him speak. They're going to judge everything I say, Malik continued, anxiety evident in his voice. One wrong word, and they'll think I've sold out. That I'm just trying to be something I'm not. David turned to face him directly. Who you are is exactly why they need to hear from you. You're not some motivational speaker with a rehearsed story. You're real. You lived it. You're still living it. Malik peeked through the curtain again. He spotted Marcus, a younger teen from the shelter who'd been asking him for advice about school. Behind Marcus sat Mr. Chen, a software engineer who'd offered to teach coding classes at the shelter. They were all there, waiting. What if they ask about my mom? Malik's voice cracked slightly. Or why I'm not trying to find her? Then you tell them the truth, David replied. That some battles aren't yours to fight. That focusing on your future doesn't mean forgetting your past. The program coordinator approached, signaling it was time. Malik's hands trembled as he smoothed his notes one last time. You don't need those, David said quietly. Just speak from here. He tapped Malik's chest. Malik took a deep breath and walked onto the stage. The lights felt hot, and for a moment, the faces before him blurred together. Then he spotted Marcus's encouraging smile, Mr. Chen's attentive expression, and something shifted inside him. 6 months ago, he began, his voice steadier than he expected, I was sleeping in an alley behind a restaurant. Today, I'm standing here talking to you about possibilities. The room fell silent. Even the usual shuffling and whispers ceased. But this isn't a fairy tale, Malik continued. I'm not standing here because someone waved a magic wand. I'm here because when an opportunity appeared, I chose integrity over easy money. And someone else chose to see me as a person worth investing in, not a problem to be solved. As he spoke, Malik's nervousness faded. He shared the daily challenges of balancing school with shelter life, the struggle to believe in himself when others doubted him, the ongoing battle between pride and necessity. The hardest part isn't the poverty, he admitted. It's feeling invisible. Like your existence is an inconvenience to everyone around you. But you're not invisible. Your struggles are real, but they don't define you. Your choices do. From the side of the stage, David watched as Malik's words resonated through the room. Teens who had started the session slumped in their seats now sat upright, engaged. Adults who'd come out of obligation were leaning forward, truly listening. The mentorship program's success brought David and Malik closer, their initial benefactor-recipient relationship evolving into genuine friendship. They met regularly for lunch, discussing everything from Malik's college applications to David's business challenges. One such lunch, however, found David distracted. He kept checking his phone, his usual focused attention scattered. "Something wrong?" Malik asked, noticing how David had barely touched his food. David set down his phone, running a hand through his hair, a gesture Malik had learned meant serious trouble. "Remember the Singapore deal? The one from when we first met?" Malik nodded, the memory of the briefcase still vivid. "Turns out it was part of a larger problem." David lowered his voice. "The SEC is investigating several of our firm's international transactions. There are irregularities." "What kind of irregularities?" Malik asked, though his expression suggested he already understood. "The kind that end careers." David's usual confidence had vanished. "I didn't know. Or maybe I didn't want to know. But some of our partners have been operating in gray areas for years. Now it's all unraveling." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Months ago, David had nearly lost everything over a missing briefcase. Now he faced losing everything because the briefcase had been found. "The board is meeting tomorrow," David continued. "The partners want someone to take responsibility. As the public face of the firm." He left the sentence unfinished. Malik absorbed this information, his food forgotten. "But you didn't do anything wrong." "I didn't do anything right either," David replied. "I saw signs. Little things that didn't add up. But the money was good, the deals kept flowing, and I told myself it wasn't my problem." The weight of this revelation settled over their table. Outside, New York continued its relentless pace, oblivious to their crisis. "What are you going to do?" Malik finally asked. "I don't know." David's admission hung heavy in the air. "Everything I've built, my reputation, my connections, it could all disappear overnight." Malik studied his mentor, seeing for the first time not the confident businessman who'd helped him, but someone as vulnerable as any shelter resident. "When I found your briefcase," Malik said slowly, "I had a choice between easy money and doing what's right." "Sounds like you've got the same choice now." David looked up, surprised by the parallel. "But it's not that simple," he protested. "There are employees who depend on me, investments to protect." "It is that simple," Malik interrupted, with a certainty that reminded David of their first meeting. "Just harder to execute." They sat in silence for a moment, the bustling restaurant providing a stark contrast to their heavy conversation. "You know what's funny?" David said finally. "I've been so focused on helping you build a future, I never noticed my own past catching up with me." "Maybe that's why we met," Malik suggested. "Not just so you could help me, but so I could help you remember what matters." David's phone buzzed again, another message from the board. He ignored it, really seeing Malik for the first time that day. The scared kid from the shelter had grown into someone with wisdom beyond his years. "When did you get so smart?" David asked, attempting a smile. "Had a good teacher," Malik replied. "Taught me that character is what you do when everything's on the line." In his penthouse office, David sat across from Malik, the city lights twinkling behind them. The morning papers lay scattered across his desk, their headlines screaming about the financial scandal. His phone had been ringing non-stop with calls from reporters, board members, and soon-to-be former friends. "I'm going to lose everything," David said, his voice hollow. The board meeting was brutal. Once I started talking, once I revealed everything I knew about the irregular transactions, there was no going back. Malik picked up one of the papers, reading the headline, "Miller Financial Group CEO exposes international banking scandal." "You did the right thing," Malik said firmly. "The right thing," David laughed without humor. "The right thing is going to cost me my company, my reputation, most of my assets once the lawsuits start flying." Malik sat quietly for a moment, then reached into his backpack. He pulled out a worn notebook and placed it on David's desk. "I've been working on something. Wasn't sure when to show you, but maybe now's the time." David opened the notebook, finding pages of carefully written notes and calculations. "What is this?" "A business plan," Malik explained. "For a foundation. One that combines financial education with mentorship. teaching kids from the streets about money management, investment, entrepreneurship, but with ethics at the core. David flipped through the pages, seeing detailed budgets, program outlines, and partnership proposals. "You did all this?" "Had a pretty good teacher in business and ethics," Malik smiled. Even if he was a bit late to the ethics part. For the first time in days, David felt a glimmer of hope. "This is, actually pretty solid. The structure, the approach. We could build something new," Malik continued. "Something clean. Use your experience, your connections, the good ones, to create real change. Not just handouts, but real education and opportunities." "We." David looked up sharply. "Partners," Malik said firmly. "Equal partners. I know the streets, you know business. Together we could bridge that gap." David studied the young man before him, remembering the scared kid who'd returned his briefcase months ago. "You understand what you're suggesting? Partnering with me right now, when my name is toxic. I understand that 6 months ago, everyone thought I was toxic too." Malik held his gaze. "You saw past that. Now it's my turn." As they discussed the possibilities, a knock at the door interrupted them. David's assistant entered, looking apologetic. "Sir, there's a Mr. Thompson here to see you. He says." An older man stepped into the office, his expensive suit marking him as someone from David's world. But his face, Malik froze, recognition hitting him like a physical blow. "Hello, son," the man said quietly. David looked between them, understanding dawning. "You're James Thompson," the man supplied. "Malik's father. Former partner at Carlton Investment Group. And," he added with a bitter smile, "the one who first discovered the irregularities in the Singapore banking system that led to all this." The revelation hung in the air like smoke. Malik stood, his hands trembling slightly. "You knew," he asked David. "About him?" "No," David answered truthfully. "But I think he knew about you." James Thompson nodded. "I've been watching. Following your progress. When I saw David Miller, of all people, taking an interest in my son, I knew it was time for the truth to come out. All of it." The three men stood in the darkening office, their shadows long against the Manhattan skyline. The past and future converged in that moment, offering a chance for redemption, reconciliation, and perhaps something entirely new. David looked at the business plan on his desk, then at father and son, seeing not an ending but a beginning. "Well," he said, "I think we have a lot to discuss."